You and I have walked, or will walk if you have booked for a future date, these streets to talk about 1888. I want to take you back a little further, to a man who never set foot in this case, who died 17 years before it happened, but who understood exactly why it happened. His name was Charles Dickens, and by the time the first body was found on Bucks Row, he'd already spent over 30 years trying to warn the country about the world that made it possible. Dickens was born in 1812 in Portsmouth, into a family that was, for a while, comfortably middle class. That didn't last. His father, John Dickens, was a naval clerk who lived beyond his means and racked up debts he couldn't pay. In 1824, when Charles was just 12 years old, his father was arrested and sent to the Marshalsea debtors' prison in Southwark. Under the law at the time, the rest of the family, Charles's mother and younger siblings, moved into the prison with him. Charles did not. He was considered, at just 12, old enough to work. He was sent to live alone and put to work at Warren's blacking warehouse, pasting labels onto pots of boot polish 10 hours a day for 6 shillings a week. The social campaigner Charles Booth regarded 20 shillings a week as the dividing line among the poor. A family earning below that line he regarded as living in abject poverty. Young Charles was surrounded by rats, damp, and other child labourers. He later said he felt utterly abandoned, that no one, not even his parents, seemed to think this was anything unusual. This is the detail people forget. Dickens didn't imagine poverty from a comfortable distance. He lived it. He knew what it felt like to be a child written off by a system that assumed he simply belonged there. That experience never left him, and it shaped almost everything he wrote. In 1837, in Oliver Twist, he took direct aim at the workhouse system, the institutions that were supposed to care for the poor under the new Poor Law Act of 1834. Dickens showed them for what they often were: starvation dressed up as charity, cruelty administered by men who congratulated themselves on their moral superiority. The famous scene, a starving child asking for more food and being treated as a criminal for it, was aimed squarely at respectable readers who assumed the poor were poor because of some personal failing. That's the hypocrisy he kept returning to. Victorian Britain loved to believe that poverty was a moral condition, that if you were destitute, it reflected something lacking in your character. Dickens' answer over and over was no. Poverty is what happens when a wealthy society builds no flaw beneath its own people. In A Christmas Carol, 1843, he wrote Scrooge not just as a miser, but as the voice of a very real, very common attitude, that workhouses and prisons existed, so why should he give anything more? Dickens has the ghost throw that logic back at him. It's not subtle. It wasn't meant to be. In Bleak House and Little Dorrit, he turned to the courts, the debtors' prisons, the very system that had taken his own father, and to show the bureaucratic cruelty that trapped people in poverty for years, sometimes generations. And it wasn't only fiction. As a journalist and editor, running magazines like Household Words and All the Year Round, Dickens sent writers into the slums of London to document the conditions directly. The overcrowding, the disease, the complete absence of sanitation. He walked these streets himself, often at night, sometimes with police escorts, to see the East End poverty firsthand. Charles Dickens died on the 9th of June 1870 at his home in Kent, having suffered a stroke the day before. He was 58. So let's be clear, he is not a suspect. He's not even a contemporary of these murders. He died 18 years before Mary Ann Nichols was found in Bucks Row in 1888. But that gap is the point. The conditions Dickens spent his life exposing, the workhouses, the overcrowding lodging houses, the complete absence of a safety net for women and children who fell through the cracks, those conditions didn't improve in the years after his death. In the East End, in many ways, they got worse. The population of Whitechapel exploded with immigration and industrial displacement. The same slum landlords, the same doss houses, the same brutal economics of survival that Dickens had written about were still very much alive 20 years later. He diagnosed the disease. Nobody cured it. And this is where it connects directly to the story that I tell on my tour, and tell more fully in my book and audiobook, Yours truly, Jack the Ripper, How the Victorians Created the World's Greatest Murder Mystery. Look at the 5 women we call the canonical 5. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. 4 of them were at the time of their deaths effectively homeless, moving between common lodging houses, paying for a bed night by night, sometimes unable to raise even the 4pence it cost to stay off the street. Kelly, the youngest, was only in her mid-20s, and she was surviving through sex work. Because in a system with almost no support for a woman alone, with no reliable income, sex work was often the only currency left. These weren't women living outside the respectable world by choice. They were women the system, the same system Dickens spent his whole career writing about, had simply failed. No safety net, no minimum wage, no social housing, a poor law that treated destitution as a character flaw rather than a structural failure. That's why I don't think you can understand these murders, really understand them, by focusing only on the killer. The killer needed a hunting ground, and poverty built it for him. Vulnerable women sleeping rough with no one checking on them. That vulnerability was manufactured by decades of policy and neglect. Dickens spent his life pointing at exactly that machine. And here's the hypocrisy Dickens kept circling back to. And it's worth saying plainly, because it's the same hypocrisy that shaped how these murders were reported and remembered. Victorian society could be sentimental about poverty in fiction. Readers wept over Little Nell, over Tiny Tim, while stepping past the same suffering on their own streets. It could build workhouses and call them charity while making them so punishing that people would rather starve than enter one. And when women were driven to sex work by poverty, that same society was quick to judge them as morally fallen, rarely asking what choices they'd actually had. Dickens' whole project was holding a mirror up to that contradiction. Not the poor are dangerous, but the poor that are made vulnerable and then blamed for the vulnerability society created. Yes, there was a man, or several men, responsible for these murders, and their identity is the mystery that draws us to the story. But there was also a system responsible for the conditions that made these women so exposed, so unprotected, so easy to erase. Charles Dickens spent his life trying to make his readers see that system. He didn't live to see 1888, but if he had, I don't think he'd have been surprised. Thank you for listening. This is Richard Walker saying goodbye.